Hi, Stephen from OWNorDisown. It's time at last. For months we have been debating how RTX laptops will perform and how they will compare to Pascal and whether they'll be worth the upgrade. You get tensor cores to help with AI deep learning and ray tracing, but for the most people, they would probably want to see, how much extra frames they will get. So let's take a look. HID Evolution were kind enough to send me the MSI GE75 Raider, which is available in either an RTX 2080 model for $2,800 or my model, the 2070, for $2,300. Now the advantage with HID Evolution, you can do some configurations. Now both models do come with a 17.3 inch 144Hz 3 millisecond IPS level display, and now both models will have the i7-8758 CPU, which is a 6-core, and for $95 you can upgrade and do a thermal repaste with conductor node and Fuji poly pads. That's what I have. Now I have Windows Home Edition. It's been a clean install, and I have 16 gigabytes of RAM, the 256GB SSD, and I also have 1 terabyte storage on a hard drive. Now 17-inch thin bezel laptops will be the rage this year, and this GE75 is going to be no exception. Now compared to traditional 15-inch laptops, it's not much bigger, and at just under £6 or even £8 with a power brick, it is very portable. The panel back is made out of aluminium, and it's not a brushed look this time, but more of a speckled look, which I actually do prefer. You get the usual red decals, which, unlike the MSI emblem, they don't light up. The keyboard deck is also made of aluminium. The SteelSeries keyboard is nice, has a good distance of travel, and the keys are well spaced. The RGB key lighting is very bright, and it really makes it pop. The Windows Precision Kit trackpad is smooth and fairly large, with large separate mouse buttons and a red accent around it. You also have easy access to volume and screen brightness controls. Now to the right there are 3 buttons. You have the power button, you have a turbo fan button, and one that cycles through various keyboard lighting preset patterns. MSI installs its Dragon Center software, which allows you to check system resources, alter between sport, eco and comfort modes, as well as alter fan speeds and create profiles. Now one thing they do include is a battery calibration tool to keep your battery in top shape. If you like to keep track of things using your mobile phone, they also have a companion app. Now at 360 nits, the screen copes fairly well with glare, despite it having a fairly glossy display. The GMA panel produces a decent colours at about 94% sRGB, and it's quite standard fare for these 144Hz panels, and it's fine for content creation. Now compared to the 144Hz panel on my Razer 15, it actually performed better in my ghosting test. As for light bleed, there's a little bit at the lower edge, but nothing drastic. Despite the narrow bezels, the webcam is still up top, and this is what it's like. This is the webcam, 720p. This is what it sounds like as well. I really liked how the USB ports glowed red, making them very easy to see in the dark. You can actually configure the lighting of this to either breathe or pulse using software. On the left side we have a Kensington lock, large air vent, Ethernet, HDMI, which is good for 4K at 60Hz, a mini display port, USB 3.1 Type A, a USB 3.1 Type C, and separate headphone mic jacks. Round the back there are no ports, but the model name Raider proudly brandished in the centre. On the right we have the power port, which is positioned at the rear. We have a large heat exhaust, 2 USB 3.1 Type A ports, and an SD card reader that leaves the card sticking out by about 25%. MSI ships a 280 watt brick with it, and I saw a 216 watt power pull from the wall. This was still less than a similarly configured GTX 1070 laptop would pull. Now to get inside, you remove 13 Phillips head screws. The base is, is made of ABS plastic and has like an alien like markings on it. Now it's nice and solid and helps keep the base nice and cool. It has some good air intakes and also 4 speaker grills. You will notice it has 2 3-watt subs and 2 3-watt speakers. Here is the 256GB PCI Express SSD with another spare slot to the side. You have 2 RAM slots maxing out at 64GB, and you have a 1TB Seagate Barracuda hard drive with an Intel 9560 Wi-Fi card. You have the CPU here and the GPU here. There are 3 heat pipes for the CPU and 2 heat sinks. 4 separate heat pipes for the GPU plus 1 shared one by the CPU. And 2 nice large heat sinks. And here you have the 51 watt-hour battery, which is good for 3.5 hours of runtime. Here are the speeds of the included SSD, hard drive and the SD card reader. I use the UHS-2 SD card to prevent any bottlenecks, but to be honest, 30 megabytes per second for the SD card is quite disappointing. At idle, the fans are a reasonable 35 decibels, but at load they do get quite loud at 52 decibels, using both the auto and the max fan. The center of the keyboard is the hottest at 39 degrees Celsius, but this is more than acceptable and feels fine to the touch. As you can see, hot air is blown nicely out of the sides and the rear. Underneath, the ABS plastic shields the heat very well. 30 degrees Celsius is fantastic. Let's see how it performs. Using the V-Ray benchmark, I wanted to see how the tensor cores helped the RTX 2070 over the GTX 1080, and I was blown away that it was over twice as quick. Now this does bode very well for if you have software that can take advantage of RTX. I also test how well it can multitask by running repeated runs of Cinebench whilst the Heaven benchmark was running in the background. You know, it was up there with the best I've tried, producing a 932 score in Cinebench. Now using Adobe Premiere Pro to render a 4GB file using a software acceleration, you can see that it even beats out the stock clocked i7-8850H CPU, only trailing it when that was actually overclocked. I tried to push the CPU harder, but undervolting it wasn't easy. HID Evolution had already applied a 65mV undervolt to it, and I could not go any lower. Using Handbrake to encode the same file to MP4 really stresses the CPU for a long time. At stock, it beat out the same CPU in the Asus G703, but that could be pushed further, suggesting I was being power limited here. I throw in the result of my GTX 1080 laptop with a desktop i7-8700K for comparison. For my gaming tests, I did overclock the RTX 2070 using Afterburner and got a good 131 MHz extra on the core and 904 on the memory. This GDDR6 memory really overclocks well. Nvidia heavily pushes 2 games when they announce the RTX, both showcasing the benefits of ray tracing. First up is Battlefield 5 in DX12 with ray tracing enabled, but in a map that doesn't have many reflections, so in fact it's not really being used. Now this is at 1080p ultra settings. As you can see, I'm getting about 80 FPS with GPU boosting up to about 1575 MHz and 99% utilization. Now compare this to the same settings on a map that has puddles on the roads or canals, plenty to show reflections. The frame rate dips to about 55 FPS. The game is still playing fine, and this was with ray tracing set to ultra. Overclocking the GPU sees a 2070 boost even into the 1800s and a slight increase in frame rate. But when there are a lot of reflections going on, expect this to drop into the 40s, so you may have to lower this ray tracing setting. So here we have DX12 with no ray tracing on the same map, and the frame rate doubles. I still think the game looks fine, and let's face it, in a fast multiplayer game, you don't really have time to look at your own reflection in a puddle and probably want to maximize your frame rate. It is fine for single player missions though. Here is a comparison shot of reflections on a marble floor. They definitely look much better with ray tracing on. In this chart, I compare the RTX 2070 to the GTX 1080 and 1070 Max Q. There's not a lot to choose between the 1080 and the 2070 here, even in DX11. And the 2070 is a nice 35% of the 1070 Max Q. Here's Battlefield 1 DX12 Ultra settings, and you will see that the frame rate is similar to Battlefield 5, but this time the GTX 1080 is 10% faster. The 2070 is about 5% faster than the 1080 Max Q and 15% faster than the 1070 it replaces. Now I interpret this as the drivers are being more optimized for the new ray tracing games, and I hope Nvidia equally supports Pascal going forward. Now let's look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Here it is on the RTX 2070. We are getting a solid frame rate with a high GPU utilization. The GE75 is doing a fine job of cooling the system too. The GPU generally peaks at about 83 degrees and the CPU runs in the mid-60s, maintaining its turbo boost nicely. Again, we see very similar performance to the GTX 1080, and in fact, overclocking the 2070 sees it sneak ahead. That is pretty good stuff. But let's look at Rise of the Tomb Raider, again with DX12. This time the GTX 1080 is 17% faster than the 2070. Sure, the latter nearly matches it when overclocked, but the difference is real and tangible. Even the 1080 Max Q beats the 2070 here, and the 1070 is only 5% behind. So, does this reinforce my idea on driver optimization? In PUBG, the GPU probably goes through about 90% utilization, but I got a nice consistent frame rate, and again temperatures are great. As before, the GTX 1080 is about 10% ahead of the 1070, and in turn that was about 32% ahead of the 1070. But the 2070 overclocks well and matches the 1080. Now finally, Fortnight Epic settings, we get a higher GPU utilization and frame rates are in the 120s, and that will satisfy most competitive gamers. This time the GTX 1080 was 13% faster than the 2070, and that in turn was 11% faster than the 1070. And here are a summation of my results. I test using Auto Fan and Max Fan, also overclocking the GPU using the Max Fan. These are the games that I ran. Some of them I don't have the slides for, will be in the next video. I include metrics such as the CPU clock speeds, average and max, the same for its watts and the temperature. And the same for the GPU, the average and max clock speeds as well as their temperature and the watts pulled on the GPU. And to also show the minimum and average FPS if it was possible. And I also do some CPU benchmarks here down at the bottom, and comparing it to the published clock speeds, we're looking at 1215 to 1440 megahertz. You can quite clearly see here that the GPU actually, you know, its average is pretty much at its published boost clocks, but it does boost up a lot more, quite a lot more here. And even when you overclock it, 2025, so that is a big improvement. And the laptop, you know, during gaming, its clock speeds pretty much the boost is pretty good, but of course the i7 doesn't hold it when you're doing a long test like here, and I couldn't boost it any further more, and I couldn't undervolt it any further than what it was. Temperatures, you know, are pretty good. We're looking at the CPU average temperatures here on about 65 degrees and maxing about 73. Switching to the Max Fan did help slightly, but not a huge amount. And looking at the GPU temperatures, again like 78 averaging, but it would peak out about 83, and according to the settings it would you know, throttle at 87, so we didn't actually reach 87. And watts wise, you know, average watts on the GPU were around about 100 and 106 or so, and about 118, 119 at peak. And of course overclocking it did increase it to about 124. So how would I sum up the MSI GE75 radar? Well, I must say I do like it. It's relatively thin, it's lightweight, and now with those slim bezels it makes it not much bigger than the 15-inch notebook. The fact that this chassis can hold and probably cool a full RTX 2080 is incredible. The big question is whether it would power throttle or not. Now the key lighting is great, and those speakers are up there with the loudest that I've heard at about 83 decibels. Now they need to be though, because those fans do get rather loud, but they do a good job at keeping both the components and the chassis cool. I must say HID Evolution did a great job here. How about the RTX 2070? Well, on non-ray tracing titles it seems to perform about 10% less than the GTX 1080, so similar to a 1080 Max Q. And for $2,300 that is not bad, considering you also get ray tracing, and those tensor cores can certainly accelerate certain applications. So for a professional that uses that type of software, it could be a benefit. The 2070 averages 15% ahead of the 1070, which I predicted in one of my earlier videos, and I stand by what I said there. The 1070 laptop can be had for about $1,500, so, and if you don't care about ray tracing, that's where the value lies. I'd like to thank you for watching, and make sure to subscribe as I have a bunch of RTX footage coming up. Bye.